Hello and welcome to Teach Me School Stuff. I'm going to show you what was what still is my favorite version of iMovie, and that was the very original iMovie 06, otherwise sometimes referred to as iMovie HD. Now, why is it my favorite version of iMovie to work with? Well, there's actually a number of reasons, which I'm going to go over in this particular video. So the first reason is because of the user interface. It is such an easy program to work with visually, and I find the newer version of iMovie not nearly as intuitive or simple to work with as this one. If I have this open and I want to bring video clips into here, here's my desktop, all I have to do is drag and drop them into what's referred to as the clips pane. And then when I have the clips pane here, I can see all my video clips there, and then I have this timeline down here. Now this timeline was one of the nicest aspects of this version of iMovie, and then they got rid of the timeline when they remade iMovie for iMovie 08. And there was this hue and cry of people out there that the timeline was gone, as well as some of the video effects, which is really what I want to get into a little bit later in this video. So when I'm in timeline mode, I can zoom in a little bit here and see this one particular clip that I've got. It's only about 3 seconds long. But let's take a look at this clip. It's a very boring clip. It's just like this rocking horse at a park. So what I did, I'm teaching, sort of introduction to experimental video with my students, and I give them a folder full of very boring footage. There's that clip, which I put in the timeline. There's this one here, which is just like a shot of some trees. If I drag this along here, you'll see all I do is kind of zoom in and zoom back out again. It is not great footage, but it's deliberately not great. Here's one of just swings. And yes, I actually had to run around and push the swings and then step off to the side while kids nearby are kind of wondering what I'm up to out in the park doing that. In any case, let's get back to our timeline here. So in timeline mode, you can see clips. So all the clips would sit next to each other, or you can see what's referred to as the timeline. The timeline actually now gives you points on the timeline with the time associated with them. A couple of things I really like about this timeline view. One is if I want to turn off the audio of the original video clip. So let's say I'm going to eventually make these into a music video. And that is the assignment that I have my students do. I have them create an abstract experimental video put to a piece of music that they've made themselves in GarageBand. And it's an old version of GarageBand too, so it's very electronic sounding, but yes, we could use any newer music that we've constructed. But of course, the students don't need the audio from here, and it's just so easy to turn off. It's just a checkbox at the end of that track. If they want to keep the audio, let's say this is a narrated video of some sort, and the audio has to come up and down. If you go to View, it usually defaults with the clip volume levels already shown, but you end up with a purple line along this, just like the sort of volume line that you get in GarageBand. So if kids are used to using GarageBand, they're familiar with being able to, fade audio out and then fade audio back up. It's done exactly the same way here in this version of iMovie. So I really like that as well. What you can't do in this version of iMovie, while I'm thinking of it, is you can't green screen. So anything you want to do using green screen, this is not the version of iMovie for you. Okay, now I got that out of the way. Another thing you should be aware of is that the video clips that I'm playing with here were originally shot in a 4:3 aspect ratio. Who does that these days? Well, webcams still do, a lot of them. In this case, in fact, this footage was shot probably about 15 years ago, the first time I ever did something like this with my students, using more than likely digital video tape. Some of the newer handy cams that I've used with my students will still be able to be set to shoot in 4:3, and I usually just tell my students, just do that. But you can actually change the settings for importing. If you go to iMovie and look at the preferences, here there's a checkbox to automatically DV, pillar box, and letterbox the clips. So if you don't do that, or if that's not checked and you bring your footage in, it's possible it doesn't pan and scan like those of us that remember the original, pan and scan videos or DVDs when that was a thing. Instead, what it'll do is it'll squash the video. It'll compress it to fit within the 4:3 aspect ratio. It's going to make it look all squashed. Now let's take a look at within media, or within the editing, I'm not going to go into titles because there's other videos out there on the internet that deal with that, with this version of iMovie. But I didn't see anything that talked about this palette of visual effects with iMovie. And this is where this version of iMovie is just really, really far out. Let me turn off my clip volume levels. So it has your standard kind of old-timey movie, and I can make this more extreme by stretching that over there, bring it back. There's a jitter effect, the exposure, and so on and so forth. There's black and white. There's fog. I think some newer versions of iMovie might even still have fog. But there's a number of other things in here that are definitely not there anymore, like electricity is one. You might think, when would I ever want to use this in a video? Well, if it's an experimental video, and I drag this down and I put a few of these across the screen, it's going to do some pretty far out things when I start to apply some of the other effects. So I'm actually going to put that in there. And I'm going to add another one. So any of these effects that you apply can be built on top of one another in this version of iMovie. I'm sure maybe stuff like this can be done like that in newer versions of iMovie as well. But I'm going to leave those two things there deliberately. Now, another couple things you have is like fairy dust. Okay, well, let's just put fairy dust in there. Now, I'm absolutely going to admit up front, this is corny looking. But that's not the purpose of this video. Now, when students have the option, once they've done their experimental video, when they go to make their own video, they might say, yeah, that was all interesting and far out, but I'm really not going to use this. But I have had some students that really embrace some of the things that you can do with this version of iMovie. So now, I've applied those three effects, but let's take a look at mirror. So mirror now does this sort of thing. And I can change where the mirror occurs horizontally. So I could sort of do something like that, because I kind of like what happened with that sort of shooting star thing. And you can also apply a mirror effect vertically. So there's without it, and here's with it. So I'm going to keep that. Why not? But I'm not even into yet some of the really interesting and far out effects that this version of iMovie had. Let's go to n square. So n square takes your picture and it multiplies it by 4 across the screen. So let's apply that effect. Then what I could do is take that same effect and apply it on top of itself again. So let's do that. Now, if I play this experimental video for you, I've taken that really boring footage of a rocking horse and I've turned it into something really far out and abstract looking. I don't know where my lens flare effect went, or that little pixie dust thing. But to eliminate any of the video effects you apply, all you have to do is hit the delete button, and it deletes one effect at a time. So I'm going to go back to this and show you the Quartz Composer. And I remember when I updated my computers teaching media arts and I got a newer version of iMovie, and I told my students that they were going to do an experimental video, and then 5 or 6 of the kids that had the newer computers put up their hands and they said, I don't see the Quartz Composer in my visual effects. I was like, what? And they said, yeah, my timeline looks completely different. I don't even think I have one. And I couldn't believe it. So then I got online and I discovered there was a whole world of other people out there that really felt the same way. Let's take a look at some of the things that the Quartz Composer could do. So some of them, again, are a bit corny. This bloom is a bit like the Gaussian blur. Bump distortion, circle splash distortion gets a little more far out. Color monochrome is like sepia tone, so there's not much new about that. Color posterize, same sort of thing. But now we get into like crystallize. Let's take crystallize and minimize it. And now let's expand the radius of these crystals so that now we've created something that looks like this. So I don't even see the rocking horse anymore. This is now more about shapes and colors and textures. When I'm teaching this version of video production, we're talking about experimental video that is really a response to, a visual response to the music that they've created. And so I really want them to push this in the abstract direction. Let's go to edge work. What edge work does is it takes basically black outlines to an absolute extreme. The more intense you make this, again, it just becomes these sort of large abstract globs. Edges, which seems to have the same sort of name, is a very different kind of effect. It sort of applies a little bit of a neon effect to outlines of things. That one's kind of interesting. Let's go through a few more of these. Certainly the more interesting ones. I've got glass distortion, which is pretty much like it sounds. It looks like I'm looking through, rippled glass. Negative, you might still have negative. Now that looks really cool, right? My shooting star is turned into this blue thing, and my blue electric bolts have turned yellow. Newspaper, maybe. Let's go to pixelate. So if I reduce pixelate, that's the original. Here I make it extreme, and again it becomes something like a very abstract expression of the music. The effect in basically means how long is it going to take for the effect to take effect, and then the effect out means that the effect will fade out. So here's the fade in of the effect, and then the fade out of the effect. Pointillize is similar, but in this case it uses circles instead. So if I really change the radius out, and I change the the effect in and out, I get something like this. So if I have a very, light, boppy, electronic piece of music, this might really work with that. Starshine applies things like this. So sort of like my shooting star, if I drop a few of these across the screen, then they start to do very interesting things when you start to apply the other effects. So let's just take that one starshine, which looks like that, and you can change the width of it, the color of it, and so on and so forth. But let's now go back to, something like my crystallize with that starshine there. If I reduce the effect of the crystallize, it's now just kind of this pulse of shapes in the bottom right corner of the screen. So if we go full screen, that's without the effect. Let's see if it'll play this. It's not applying the effect. This is one thing, by the way, you do have to be very careful of with old versions of iMovie. I don't think I applied that effect. Is that you need to save your work. New versions of iMovie don't save the work. Oh, sorry, the new versions do save the work. The old versions don't. So if you get so far into this, you get so wrapped up in applying these effects, and then suddenly you get the spinning pinwheel of doom, you may have lost everything that you've done. It's possible, though, that when you reboot the program, it'll say that there's a bunch of things still found in the trash, and do you want to sort of open them? And if you say yes, that's probably your clips that have had some of the effects applied to them. So you might be able to save some of your work that way. So now, what happened to this version of iMovie? My understanding is that Apple, which created this, with the idea, I think, that everybody was going to go out there and start making some really wild and funky videos. But then over time, they probably did enough surveys of people to discover that barely anybody was even editing film, let alone using these video effects. So they stripped it all away when they created iMovie 08. And they thought, listen, people are just they're going to take their 20 clips of their vacation, they're going to put it all into one big lineup, and they're going to hit, save to USB, and that's going to be it. But of course, if you're, looking to explore and experiment with this as a visual tool for creating art, there really was a lot going for iMovie 06. So I hope that by showing you some of the neat things that it can do, I haven't gotten into the transitions, but if you want to make your video look even more 1980s-ish, there's some very interesting sort of side swipes and circle wipes and things like that to add some interesting transitions to your videos as well. So I hope that helps you make your videos look more interesting. Thanks for watching.